record. There it is. We'll give it a few, let some others join. Had about probably, I think, got about 13 people so far, but probably about a third to a little less than half probably won't make the first one. So we'll see how well it goes here, and then we'll keep rolling it. Wow. Be curious to hear everyone's kind of view of things, state of governance. I think that's one of the things that I really want to try to get from this is a clear assessment of where people are at with governance, and we'll see what how many vendors versus practitioners versus new versus older versus who's wanting to come out and talk governance. I think is an interesting sign right now. Let's go ahead and slow roll. I mean, we're 3 minutes in. We'll give it, maybe some others will join, but um let me kind of start with, I think, for especially the folks who are going to watch via recording, we'll make this public shortly after. I'll publish it to YouTube. And I don't have a lot of expectations for this first one, but like anything else, I think it'll take a little bit of time to roll, get people involved, and get people more familiar that it's happening. Um, and so my goal is really with this is to get an assessment of where folks are at with their governance, and not just practitioners. I want vendors here. I want analysts. I want anybody who, producers, consumers, um, and see where people are at and get an honest assessment of kind of what does governance even look like? What does it mean? Because still getting a lot of mixed signals there. So I want to keep this slot in the cards every week, but I want to try to keep it rolling and have the feedback loops with y'all. So I don't want it to just be my agenda. And I had a quick little bulleted list that I threw out with the original story and the calendar event. Dave suggested that we talk about leadership and convincing leadership that this is needed. Thank you for that, Dave, because it's super critical. I would say having governance programs started and then shut down because they didn't have priority or they didn't have that top down, I think is one of the biggest problems. So I added that. Another from a customer I'm working with right now is, where do we start? Where do we even begin? And what scope, what scale? How do we have an impact, but how do we not break things and get people involved? So I added that. But before we dive too much deeper, I'd like to just go down and get introductions and hear where you're at. Where's your head at regarding governance? And there's no right answer there. Like, how do you see things? What's the world look like to you? Let's start off with Buddha. Dive in, Buddha.
Hey, hi, I am Buddha, developer advocate at Tyke. Worked with API management for a long time, and obviously, I think for those familiar with API management, um, you know how big a role API governance plays in that particular space. Recently, we hosted Leap 2.0, which was the API governance conference, and the idea there was kind of similar to what we're trying to achieve here, which was to understand where people are in their overall API governance journey. What are some of the big key issues, topics, challenges, and more importantly, also solutions and outcomes that people care about, have been able to achieve. Um, to me, I think governance there are multiple aspects to it. I think that's where the challenge perhaps comes in. To me, governance is being able to do the. I know this is a very traditional approach to API governance, but traditional approach is with governance, you're essentially putting in the right guardrails for you to be able to achieve the outcomes in a way that doesn't break things necessarily, or things don't go horribly wrong. To me, that's kind of where the starting point is. I know it's a lot more nuanced in terms of how you approach governance today and how you should be looking at your governance practices. It's not a platform-centric approach. It's not a tech-centric approach. It is a very business and people-centric approach that needs to be considered when we're thinking about API governance, which was again a very big takeaway from Leap as well, where a lot of conversations were about the people and the processes before diving into, hey, this is a tech problem and with a tech solution. Let's bring in this platform. It'll solve all of our governance requirements. It's good to see that narrative shifting. I think there is still a lot more work to be done in the way people approach that whole business problem to a business outcome, where ideally they don't want a platform or a tool leading what that solution to that business problem or a governance problem looks like and helping you achieve that very specific outcome. Whereas it still has to be something where you have a business problem, you need governance to make sure that things are working in order and with the right guardrails, with platforms or tools that are shaped or flexible enough to take those processes and basically be the enforcers, and then you've got outcomes on the back of it. There is room for open standards to guide some of those conversations. There is, but a lot of it is dependent again on who is responsible with an organization to make it all happen. And as part of their responsibility, it has to be to get all stakeholders together to understand the value and importance of API governance. So I think that's where I see governance playing a really, really big part, but equally also a challenge in bringing people together to understand the value that API governance has, especially now that we are going into the world of AI and the models and the things where it has to be a different approach to how you model your APIs to ideally be consumed by AI agents, whether that needs something of a different approach or whether that needs to be similar approach with different balances, checks and balances in place. It is the new world that we're looking into. And now more than ever, if you don't have your API house in order, which to me is still API governance, the consequences could potentially be dire, and we don't want to go there. So that's where, to me, that's why API governance matters. And I'm hoping to learn a little bit more. I'm not an expert here. I'm looking to learn from the people who have been in the business for a long time. So appreciate having me here.
Like that. I love the business and the human focus. I think we're all learning. I think that's one thing I learned about governance, both being a tooling and service provider, but also on the ground doing it, is there's so much to learn. Dave, how do you see things?
Hey there. Yeah, so I've been kind of practicing API governance for I don't know, the last 12 years. So it's kind of near and dear to my heart. My view of governance is basically it's processes and communication that help organizations deliver the right APIs. Without governance, you run the risk of building the wrong thing, building the wrong solution, or building something that's not properly secured. I want to thank Buddha and Tyke for the API conference that they had with Leap 2.0. It was very useful. It was good to hear all the input from a lot of other people, and there was some good discussion there. People talking about how APIs basically are kind of analogous to, if your business is your home, right? APIs are adding new doors or windows to your home, and the more you have, the more you have to watch who's coming in. And if you don't properly govern them, you have bad actors coming in your front door. That type of thing is important. I think the industry has done a good job with understanding security risks for web applications, and OWASP has been really good for that. And now we've got OWASP API security vulnerabilities, a top 10 list of that. And so I think most organizations have kind of embraced or understand that you can't just put out a web application that has a SQL injection issue in it, right? And so the analogous thing is now happening with APIs. I think organizations are realizing, yeah, these APIs are another gateway or entry into my business, and we have to protect them. So there's a lot of business value in having those APIs. You can attract new partners and have new innovation and new opportunities, et cetera. But there are risks involved with that. So governance is really kind of trying to manage those risks, understanding what they are, first of all, and that's where we can all help each other to understand. There's a lot of stuff going on with API discovery right now, and API sprawl seems to be kind of a big topic the past year or so. So that's part of it, understanding what your footprint is, and what you really need to be managing. And I,
So
in response to Tyke, as I was watching the LEAP conference, one of the things I posted was that really API governance is really important for engendering trust with all stakeholders. And I got a really good response to that comment. And I think that's kind of what I view it as, is you want your business partners to trust you, that you've got APIs that are secure, they do the right thing, and so you build trust. And so having good governance process helps you establish that trust with all the stakeholders, internal and external stakeholders.
like the trust piece. Oops, am I still on mute?
No, I can
No,
hear you.
hear me? Oh, sorry, my bar is not popping down. Weird. Anyways, well, I'm glad you can hear me. The trust piece is super critical and essential to all this. And I would say the challenges I've seen are mostly because of lack of trust there. So we can dive in more. And I want to ask you more about design and relationship with design as well. I think that's an important one. But let's keep going. Uh, how do I pronounce your name? Joa? Joa?
It's João. I know it's hard to
Yeah.
pronounce, but
Thank
thank you. I'm João. I work at NOS, which is a telco company in Portugal, and I've been around the API space and the integration also for quite a few years, and I feel very deeply for this technological space, and I agree with everyone. First and foremost, API governance to me is a tool to foster the right conversations and to bring to light the necessary data points and start the conversations to align people and multiple departments, because nowadays companies have technology verticals, different technology verticals, and you are governing multiple roadmaps that occur at the same time. So the people aspect and the communication networks that and channels that you create with API governance is very important. And also, like Dave said, the security aspect is very important nowadays, and also the AI APIs and agentic APIs. But for me, more than guardrails are important, but having the right conversations with people helps to sell the governance part and also to fine tune how you do governance. Governance is not only about blocking this and that and applying the best practices, but also where you draw the line between what you enforce and what you do not enforce.
I think it's a very interesting conversation. Sorry, a very interesting conversation around the balance between autonomy versus governance. I think that's always a curious case where you have to think about how do you still you maintain a semblance of, I wouldn't say control, but perhaps confidence in your infrastructure, confidence in your APIs, while at the same time enabling or empowering people to innovate on top of it. And that's where I feel governance has a big part to play, where it's seen as this blocker and inhibitor, whereas it can be that thing that helps you drive innovation because you have confidence in your system as opposed to just pure rigid controls out there. So I think that could be an interesting way of taking it.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely the control aspect and how people see governance is a fascinating one. Paul.
Hey everybody, and it's always good to see and hear Ken, my friend from a long time ago, in person, live. So my name is Paul, and I am a roving technologist. I mostly focus on small and medium-sized businesses, small contracts, those kind of things. Specifically, at this point in my life, trying to focus that on ecology, various different things about the environment, agriculture. And so I come from a space of mostly testing and quality management. I have worked with the IEEE to develop standards around, secure and reliable systems, principles and practices, normative standards, not like, how to do the thing exactly. And the governance thing is interesting to me because in that work with the IEEE, it had to do with DevOps. And, standards are mostly for people in regulatory and high compliance organizations, large organizations, banks and telcos and stuff. And so the question really is like, if something can't scale to the big, or if something can't scale down to the very small and be meaningful and have some tailored or whatever, but like if the concepts are there and can only scale to a particular thing, is it kind of a universal truth? Is there enduring value in the thing? Or is it just a niche for a particular segment or sector? So I think what's interesting is like how Dave and Buddha were talking was I think there's actually a need whether it's governance or I also come from the non-functional criteria, what used to be called non-functional criteria, performance and reliability, SRE and DevOps work, and identifying what are the appropriate thresholds and alerts and things that it's not just a function of the system, but it's actually what takes things down is sometimes timeouts. And so the question is, how do you make the case for that very non-visible work? And if the 10 plus years of watching the API space say anything, it's that it used to be hard to make the case for API as a product, for instance. That was on the early part of the adoption curve. And now we've gotten so like there's APIs for everything. And by default, even the smallest businesses that I work with, they build their micro front ends and then their micro back ends as APIs. Like by default, it's layered in. But therein lies the problem, which is if it's by default and it's sort of hidden work, then it becomes harder to make the case. And so you got to kind of do that continuously. It's not just good enough to make it like yearly or in each half to get more funding or to get continued funding. You kind of got to be making that case continuously. So I think reconnecting that to the business focus, right? The factors of what is the focus of the business this quarter, that year, and so on and so forth, ends up being the work that you have to do to take the enduring values of why governance is important, but constantly be reiterating them in the way that business, with its very little and time and lack of focus, or quarterly focus, narrow focus, can reconsume like they have been, hopefully for years. So I'm mostly here to listen, but one of my current motions is to help with a standard that will probably get cross-adopted, just like the DevOps thing did. It's was IEEE 32675 that got cross-adopted to IEC and ISO. And so we're working on a standard for observability, and again, normative standard. So my particular focus area in just kind of listening to what governance means is how can we ensure that proper observability practices are in place and by default, just like how there should be good proper security controls and practices in place. Same thing with observability. So
Like that. I know there's some feedback on that. Anybody want to dive in before I chime in? No. Well, I would tie that to what Buddha opened with is, so from my vantage point, make governance is oftentimes just about making APIs visible and specifically API operations visible, because you got to elevate that to business leadership to see it, to care about it, and so I'm sure a lot of what you're talking about, Paul, is observability from classic kind of IT technical ops sense. But I also feel where to begin and convincing leadership is comes, you got to make these things visible. You got to make them something that people can see, so they're not just a technical configuration. And if we don't, and you don't do that in perpetuity, your chances of being your budget's cut, going away, let alone even not even get started, is a real problem. So I think convincing leadership, and I'd love to get more clarity from you, Dave, on like have you what have you seen work or not work, or like where you think people need to be equipped most when it comes to convincing business leadership to fund governance. You're on mute.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I didn't introduce myself at the beginning for people who don't know me. So I'm Dave Bisak. I work at Aperture. Aperture is a provider of digital banking in the United States. So we've got a few hundred community banks and credit unions who are our clients, and we run their online banking, their web app and their mobile apps and things like that. So as our name implies, Aperture, API is a big part of what we do. We're an API first company, and we strive to build APIs around everything we do. So I'm in a very fortunate position in that when the company was founded, the founders wanted to embrace APIs, and they brought me in basically to build the API program at our company. So I'm Chief API Officer now. So I was really fortunate in that I didn't have to do a lot of convincing. They knew that I had experience from my previous position, and told them, if you're going to have an API program, you have to have a certain level of governance around it. So they let me kind of go with that. So I was able to establish that. But in talking with lots of other people, I do see a lot of people have a hard time with convincing their leadership, executive management, et cetera, of the need for governance. So that's, I kind of wanted to see how other people approach it. Ken on this page that he's showing us here, kind of defines governance as the process of making and enforcing decisions. And I kind of fall back on the book Continuous API Management, which has, the beginning of that book has got really good chapter on this notion of identifying what are the critical decisions that you have to be making and what are the costs of making the wrong decisions. And I kind of hold that pretty close to my heart, that a big part of this API governance is making those decisions. And what's useful about governance, this is what I use to try to help sell it and continue to get support for it, is we've made a lot of the hard decisions, so that the API program is in line with our business objectives, et cetera, and where we want to go. And that's a freeing thing, right? Once you make those decisions and you put in place processes and tools and people and roles to work with that, then people are freed from having to make those same decisions over and over again. And it's really useful. So, a simple decision like we're going to use OpenAPI instead of RAML for defining our APIs, things like that, but also lower level type things about how you implement your APIs and how you secure them and what kind of gateway you put in front of them, and what kind of processes you have in place for building around the APIs. But by using a governance program to define those decisions, and you can use architecture decision records or other types of ways of recording those things, you free up other people because then they can focus on building business value, of actually building something that does something useful. And they don't have to worry about those decisions. They don't have to try to make those decisions again. They can focus on things that are more important, right? And so you provide those guardrails. I think it was Paul that talked about kind of guardrails. And that's what these decisions do. And you put down processes and tools that can help you with people who can work with those decisions and the outcome of those decisions. You give them frameworks and processes to follow those. And you can build up tools that codify those. So if you've got, a style guide for your API, and you've got a bunch of spectral rules that enforce that style guide, you build that into your continuous integration delivery pipeline to enforce that. You shift a lot of those things as far left as you can so that things don't go too far before you realize that they don't align with business goals. So that's kind of where I am, is really kind of using governance as a way to accelerate teams and not a way to hinder or get in their way. So because you've made all these hard decisions for them, and you put down frameworks and other things that support those decisions, then they work within those guardrails, and they can really focus on getting other more important things done.
Like that, and kind of echoing what you're saying in there, Buddha, is, and you mentioned before is we got to start by talking about some of the business things, the people things, but how do you do this in a way that is not just boiling the ocean, getting everyone, it's like it seems like we do center of excellence, we do domain driven design, we do all these things that cause people to have to stop what they're doing and like participate in something, and then it doesn't go anywhere because it wasn't too in the moment. I don't know, what do you think is the right formula or right mix to get people started with this?
Are you asking me or
Is
are
that
you
a
asking
question?
Buddha?
Well, yeah, I was gonna hit Buddha, but you're welcome to Dave.
No, no, I'll let Buddha go.
I think I think for me, I think there are commonalities here with anything that you do within a business or an organization that is a little bit different from how things have functioned traditionally. And the reason I bring this up is because it's been a similar approach to when, we talk about platform engineering, for instance. How do you start that program? Or even as simple as a developer advocacy program or evangelism in an organization that has not had that before. A lot of the similar conversations could apply even to API governance, where you may have a hypothesis or a plan for what the API program looks like long term, the bigger vision of it, but you've got to break it down into something that is smaller and achievable over a time box period of time, I think. So with that, then you have to define your top KPIs, whether that's one, maybe maximum three, within a time frame that you can achieve, and then report on that result. I think that's where communication and collaborating with other stakeholders, the easiest way to get buy-in is to be able to report on success or learnings, to say, hey, we did this in 3 months' time, we were able to achieve these KPIs. If we were to invest more, whether that's resources, money, or something else from a tooling standpoint, then these are the expected outcomes based on what we have achieved already. So I think there is that need to be a bit more dynamic. And equally, if you've tried something and we realized, hey, this is really not working for us, we need to course correct. It has to be at that smaller scale, as opposed to what Kane and David you were talking about, like trying to boil the whole ocean and trying to have an entire 2-year plan in place. And suddenly, 6 months down, you're figuring out that this is completely wrong and it's not going to get us anywhere. That's a whole lot of resources, time, money, all gone to waste, which we don't want. So I think, again, it has to have the same principles as we have probably applied to many different things, where simple problem statement with a bigger vision in mind, the problem statement with the right KPI, with a specific time frame and people involved. Whatever the outcomes are within that period of time, you report on it, you communicate that, and get feedback, whether in the positive direction or not, and then course correct if necessary, or expand and scale if necessary. So that's how I would probably approach it. Because while I don't have as much experience with API governance programs directly, but within our organization, I've seen this work with, say, developer advocacy, which is my own role, which did not exist before I was there, which I think Kim, you might also know about. Platform engineering as a thing within an organization as well, and how do you make sure that it's achieving the right outcome? So I think that's how I would approach it with API governance as well.
Like the experiments. Anything else to add, anyone? Dave, Paul?
I think the only question I would ask Dave, perhaps with more experience, or maybe Paul as well, is what could those KPIs look like, you think, reporting on which you could get the right buy-in? So what could those early KPIs look like for us to be able to report on success?
So I think often it's going to be, when I look at what, leadership and executives are looking for, it's going to be things like team velocity. How long does it take for us to stand up a new API and get it out the door, get it delivered into the hands of people who are using it? And so I think that's the primary one that people are looking at is how do you get that out faster? And again, I think Booty, you said, I think in the notes here, was it Paul? The business outcomes are tying it to revenue and value. I think Buddha, you wrote that is important. And that's what most business leaders are really going to be concerned about is what are the business outcomes? can we tie this to revenue? And so velocity and productivity are going to be important metrics. So anything you can demonstrate to say, how fast do we get something out the door? And part of that is measuring, if you don't have a good adequate API governance in place and someone releases an API that doesn't get adopted very well, or it has a security vulnerability, what's the cost of remediating that, of pulling that thing back and saying, oh, we have to stop using that API. We have to contact all the developers who are using it, all of our partners, and have them migrate to something else. You have to put out the fix, but you also have to, have them stop using that current API in a reasonable way. And there are costs to that. So that's what you have to look at, is what are the business costs of not governing your APIs. And hopefully you can do that in hypothetical and not have to wait for, the really bad things to actually happen and then measure the real cost of that. No one wants to measure how much it costs to deprecate an API or to remove one that had a security vulnerability and stuff. So you want to avoid that. But at the same point, you can also say, we've gone 3 years and we haven't had a security vulnerability against our APIs. So that's where we're seeing business value is, we're not fighting fires all the time because we've tried to prevent the need to do that with governance. I'm going to let other people talk. So Paul, you had some stuff in the chat. You want to do some follow up on that?
Yeah. So the chaos is natural behavior of our universe statement is just to say that without guardrails, what are we even doing? I mean, nature takes a long time to get to local optimum, but not global optima. And really, the global optima of the universe is thermal equilibrium, which none of us probably want in our lifetime. So anyway, all that to say, it's a joke, but it's also not a joke, because when you allow teams to kind of do whatever they need to, and I don't just mean teams that you control now. What about acquisitions that were teams beforehand? You acquire something, IP or a team or a big company or something, and you end up with a not equilibrious state, right? Even though you do your due diligence, there's still stuff that and factoring into your macro norms as a larger company, or on the side of the thing being acquired, the person's being acquired, having to factor into a larger organization that has different norms. The At least in my experience, and just being careful without names, the fact is, like, businesses usually care about outcomes to the business, which is a product of a complex and dynamic set of resources, not just one single team. So sometimes what we like to do is kind of cut our losses and say, okay, this team is responsible for X, Y, and Z, which, yeah, maybe other teams depend on, i.e. the API stuff. If it's not all one team doing the API on the front end and back end and stuff like that, and doing the final delivery of the thing. The fact is, like, we sometimes need to loosely couple our results so that we can look good. Not look good falsely, but like, we did the thing we were supposed to do and in the time that we were supposed to do it, didn't we? Right? So let's imagine we execute on the API work, and not all up front just to wait for the next thing, but to kind of collaborate. And that was the second part of my comment is making allowing governance to be treated as an enabler, not a blocker, is a really hard task, because you need to not only prove that you delivered something and on time, but you need to actually be valuable to those teams, not just not an impedance, right? So you have to actually accelerate stuff they do. And so platform engineering or frameworks or API work, right? They all suffer from the, at arm's length measurement of that final outcome. Because most of the time, the final outcome, if it's not directly dollars, money, revenue, right? If it's not that, it is the timeliness of the delivered project within the quarter or within the time frame that the business needed that as a building block to whatever the heck else they were doing in the future. Wow, so that was a lot I just said there. All
Yeah.
that to say, I think if you can't connect directly to money, i.e., data as a product, i.e., APIs as a product, or funding because you're doing something fancy AI, the big buzzword. And so you're able to maybe scrape together some investor money that otherwise you wouldn't have without the buzzword. The fact is, like, undergirding that is APIs. And so I think that's definitely a direct connection. But to what Dave was saying, time is the next immediate way that you can measurably prove, like, how long does lead time to change, lead time to project kickoff, or and there's a lot of things you can do in tandem with your consuming teams, whether it's customers or internal customers or external customers, to kind of accelerate getting to a point where the teams can kind of both do some in parallel. You can start the API work and the consumer work, because you're on a same level playing ground when it comes to the standard. Um, that's one other thing that I'd love to hear is how standards, not normative standards, but literally, like, the whole world of the standards wars back in the day, and then it all became Swagger and then became Open API. Like, how many companies are really still taking their API specification model as part of their necessary governance minimum viable criteria? You know?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, I'm tired of dealing with vendors and we have to use their API and all they give us is a PDF document. It's like, man, please don't do that to me.
I mean, how do you show them
Difficult.
that it's the same, the spec and the PDF, like what's in that PDF is the same as the Open API, but it's better, it's like, how do that's a hard one.
Yeah, yeah. I'm
When you
sure
when you make when you make a pay,
I
when you make a payment for those people, just make the payment as PDFs as opposed to actual money and see what they say.
I wonder if just sending them if they really need a PDF, like, oh, you can email me the version of the spec. Just emailing them a PDF with one page that says go to this URL for our current swag. No, no.
Yeah.
I mean, the realities on the ground is you have to accept whatever you get for requirements, specs, engagement, email, PDFs, Slack, Teams, any input. I've stopped complaining too much about some of it because I just want, like, any input is good. Teams not giving feedback or waiting, you talk about shift left, Dave, waiting until the review bottleneck, right, a week before release and not engaging you at all up until then, not giving you any feedback, not giving you any requirements, and then expecting to just like get past. It's always a problem. So I just kind of welcome anything as long as they're engaged. So.
Yeah, it can be frustrating though, because what we deal with, we have a lot of new product being developed and kind of our methodology is backwards. It usually goes to the front end design team and they'll go into Figma and they'll create a mock-up of what they want the application to look like. And then I have to reverse engineer that to figure out what are the API requirements to solve that particular problem. But it's like, okay, didn't the product team have some requirements they gave to the design team in order to create that user experience? What are the jobs to be done? What was the domain driven design? What's the analysis of the problem space? So we have to get to that. I think the other thing I want to kind of bring up and mention here, and I think, Paul kind of touched on a little bit, is this notion of change. And a big part of what I view with API governance is planning for change. We know things are going to change. There's going to be, and especially in our industry, there's going to be new regulations or things, or heaven forbid, someone's going to like gut all the banking regulations in the U.S. and kill the FDIC. But anyway, we know things are going to change. So how do you prepare for that? And that's a big part of an API governance program, is understanding that things change. So making sure your APIs are evolvable, that you set them up for success, so that you can add new features to the API, you can add new responses when you need to, you can add new properties when you need to. How do you go about doing that? And how do you manage change in the software? So that's a big part of what I deal with all the time, is planning for change. And it's part of businesses. So how does a business and how does an organization stay adaptable and flexible when there is change that's coming. So rigid companies tend to not deal very well with the change, and so they have to be flexible and agile. And that filters down into our API program and then into our APIs as well.
Yeah. Great. Foundational. Any additional thoughts on change from your all's perspective?
Change is always hard, and one fact that we can count on is entropy. Entropy is everywhere. And we were discussing standards, and from our standpoint regarding industry standards, we work with two of them, like you mentioned in the chat, Ken. And you have to prove internally that the standards have value to teams all the time. It's not easy when we have new colleagues and new teams being formed. It's a continuous effort to demonstrate the value of following standards, because it's not readily apparent, and nowadays with the rate of change and the number of requirements and the amount of projects that and initiatives that a team is implementing, it's easy to get lost in shipping things to production, right? And you have to both engage the senior leadership, but also go a few steps down on the hierarchy and work with your peers and influence both up and bit lower on the organizational chart.
So what are we governing here, would y'all say? Are we governing people? Are we governing APIs? Are we governing business? Or is it just all the above? Are we governing all of it?
I think all of the above, yes. You cannot be limited to technology, because people and also the organization shape and how the DNA of a company also influences how people communicate, and the shape of the APIs and the mapping between the APIs and the business value. So you have to take all of those into account.
Would you say that the TM forum, all the standards efforts in the telco space, are those motivated or incentivized by the telcos themselves, or is it governmental? Is it market? Is it a market play? Who's driving that?
They are driven by the members themselves. The members participate on the forum and contribute amongst themselves to evolve the standards. So it's very participative and not enforced, let's say. But afterwards you have to apply that to your organization, and it's not that easy. Is one telco participating in that TM forum does not mean that we are capable of producing compliant APIs out of the box. After that, you have to keep evangelizing the standards and the practices and the guidelines that we fortunately can adopt from, for example, TM Forum. They have specific API guidelines that were already defined by them, but it's a struggle to apply that every day with the teams internally.
Yeah, that's what would you say, Buddha, as far as do you think that TM forum, kind of that model of participatory, works within the enterprise, or do you see more governance, like top down, center of excellence, here's the rules, follow them, or would you say it's a more opt-in?
Interesting enough, I've seen different models actually. I think these models, I think James Higginbotham during his closing keynote, he also touched upon a couple of possible models of governance. It seems like a centralized governance model tends to be the more common one, where you do have something centrally positioned to deal with distributed teams who just want to do their own thing, but they have the right guardrails so that they're basically focused on their own delivery and outcomes, as opposed to having to also incorporate a whole range of other things from an overall organization standpoint. So that seems to be a common one. But I've also started seeing a little bit more of these federated governance models as well, where you're also looking to empower some of these individual teams to be able to adopt their governance practices as it suits their own team requirements as well. So I think there is a balance there. I think where there is sort of that central plus federation or central or federation models. I think both are there in practice. Central seems to be more common. Um, at an enterprise level, it makes life a lot easier if it comes from a little bit more of a top-down approach, because again, the buy-ins and the stakeholders and all of that tend to be a little bit more aligned once you have that sort of a mandate, so to speak. But that also sometimes can alienate your sort of the individual teams, because it feels more like a guardrail and prohibitive as opposed to something that is meant to help you move forward faster and more productively. Um, Personally, I think there is a role of advocacy in all of governance as well, where, again, if you take that same approach of let's start small, let's report on the successes, that has to be an ongoing thing. And if you have some sort of a champion, as some people would call it, some form of advocacy where you say, hey, this is why we are doing this. These are the results you're seeing, and this is why you should be doing it too, and almost convincing the others, advocating for these outcomes, these practices, these tools, these processes overall, so that people can get aligned on this. There is a top-down mandate and there is a champion approach. I feel like the champion advocacy approach would stick a little bit better because the buy-in tends to be a little bit more holistic as opposed to mandates. But then again, mandates from a large organization, you say, you've got to do what you got to do. People tend to fall in line in some cases, I think. So I think there are both models. I would personally advocate for advocacy wherever possible, and take that approach.
Hey, Dave, on the management piece, what's the relationship between legacy API management and API governance? Do you see any relationship here between what's happened or evolution?
Yeah, I mean, I deal with that a lot because when the company was founded, we had a business unit that had legacy APIs and stuff, and we're still dealing with them today. So I advocate for a strangler pattern to eventually replace those, because again, the goals of APIs are twofold. One of which is to solve a particular business problem, but when you have these legacy APIs, who's going to use them? Right now, they're internal, but they're not publicly facing APIs. So as we build our program, we want to replace them with newer APIs that are consistent with each other, that are well documented and are complete and comprehensive, et cetera. So there's always that tension between, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? What's the business benefit of doing that work? But again, the second half of the API benefit is really in that opening up opportunities that you may not have realized were there until you have them. And the number of companies that have grown because they put APIs around their feature set. Walgreens was a really good example of that, right? They started, putting photo printing units in all their stores, and then they put an API around ordering photo prints and stuff. And, their app was able to use it. And all of a sudden, they were bringing people into the stores, and people would come into the store to pick up their photos. They end up buying other stuff. And they integrated into their app, and now people use the app, and now they order things on the app to pick up in store and stuff. It grew their business tremendously. And those are the opportunities that most people don't see. And that's what you try to do with building APIs around legacy systems, or growing those legacy systems, modernizing them. For me, a key measure of APIs is their ease of use and their success. How easy is it to adopt those APIs and to build something with them? And we find that these older legacy APIs are harder to build with because they weren't designed for reuse. They weren't designed to solve multiple types of problems. They're designed to do one specific thing, and they grew organically and things. So they weren't built with governance, and that's what you get. It's sort of the chaos that Paul talked about. And you want to avoid that because it becomes, you know, it becomes a burden to manage those over time. So um, I think I'm rambling, but it's definitely difficult balance. But you can also use them as a rationale to say, you know, these were not built with governance, and they're not really bringing in new business opportunities because of that.
Yeah. And a lot of those common aspects of those guardrails I keep hearing we're talking about, the overlaps with the platform stuff that Paul was just referencing is I have seen groups uh embrace the observability, the traceability, some of the more advanced auth, with JWT things that come with them, because they see the value and they don't have to do it. So it's I would say not just about guardrails, it's about your governance can't create more work for people, and it should do work for them. And
Right,
so
right.
that it's not just about platforms or centralizing or federated or any of these things. It's about just good work and making it and identifying those cross-cutting things, whether it's security, whether it's docs, whether it's sandbox, all of these things that should be commonplace across all of them. People are thankful when they recognize it and see it and understand it, and they'll respect it, and they'll follow the standards. And like there's a uh API monitoring standard out there. I forget, Eric Vilde pointed it to me originally, but I created an open API for it, and I saw teams trying, going, oh, we have to require a monitoring endpoint with our suite of APIs, and we didn't think about that, and we don't have time. I'm like, here's an open API for it. Here's some, ready to go stuff. Like they're like, yes, thank you. You just saved us work, and we didn't have the time. So how do you do that across the board?
Yeah, and it's like what Paul said is, the governance program should be an enablement mechanism, right? So, if you've got a well-established governance process and capabilities and process in place, then you start with an API first process. You design your API first, but from there, you throw it into your build process, and you can spin up mocks automatically, right? So the front end team can start coding against an API even before it's been implemented by the backend team, because they can just talk to the mocks. And then you get the feedback to improve the API before it's gone too far, before someone's invested a lot of time in implementing the back end. So that's really what I hope as the outcome of a good governance process is all these enablement features along the way that reduce friction and allow people to move faster and to get things done and to get the right things done.
Yep.
Amen.
At the end of the day, I think that most people would say, who are in the business, would say that like the actual consumer of an API fundamentally is the developer, right? Yeah, I mean, big picture, it's another business or an external third party or whatever. But really, who's hands-on utilizing this thing? It's a dev, whether it's from another API or process or, oh, I don't know, an app. So we're talking about devs, and I think there's a bell curve to draw for a quick second. There's a super junior dev, right? And then there's the extremely senior dev. And oftentimes what I've seen is that most of the lack of compliance comes from those edge cases. Once you get past your junior years, you maybe have built something because it was easy for you because of experience, and then you run into some, uh-oh, we didn't consult the SecOps group first, so like now we have to go through this more elaborate, takes longer to stage, and stuff like that, right? So after that first hit, where you're like, well, maybe I should look out into the world to figure out what I know. For the most part, like as the growth model goes, devs past their junior phase, whatever that is, start to research first. Start to gather the information that they think they need to have before at some point they just say, okay, let's just try some things. Let's just write the prototype, play around with some stuff, right? So there's a little bit of information gathering, and I think capitalizing on that moment, because I can't solve for the dysfunctions of the hyper junior dev in all the same conversation, or the extremely senior hard-headed person that thinks that they know everything off the bat. But it's that, like, sort of it's the garden variety okay, we're professional dev now and we're building something and we're building it either against the app or we're building the API, that I can start to reason with and say, well, you've probably been through a uncomfortable security review or an uncomfortable after the thought process architectural review. What if you could do some of that up front? Or maybe you don't even have to do all that stuff so long as you follow the guardrails, right? Even if you don't agree with every single bit of the guardrail, guess what? It's going to slipstream the work that you have to do a lot faster later on. So why have to go back? Why incur that toil factor on yourself? I think that's if you can have that basic conversation with people almost as an onboarding thing, right? And onboarding at a particular level says, hey, we do have a governance, we do have some policies in place that make sure that the stuff that we ship complies with like our risk management factors and stuff like that. So we are, we're not a tiny little company here. So for companies that actually do have onboarding, do have the need for devs to follow compliance and internal regulatory stuff, then great. In the meantime, that's the first moment. That's the capture moment where you could capture their imagination for what I was saying, which is, like the platform engineering and paid paths. It's not just the marketing that's asking for that. Like there are devs who are like, just, while I'm on the information gathering moment, could you just make it easy for me to get to the stuff?
Yeah.
And so I mean, it's not just docs, it's exercisable, templates and examples of this is what we expect as work. If you can do stuff to make that easy and work with teams that kind of own those various different, sometimes silos of patterns and practices, and that I think is where the overlap between the platform engineering, giving them a little bit of autonomy over known patterns. Same thing with Department of Defense is known to have these like stacks of technology that's just like, it's a paved path, just use that. We patch it, we make sure it's up to date, and even though it's not the latest version with that minor syntax sugar that you want, like it's still completely usable and it's approved. So don't deviate off these paths. It doesn't have to be a top-down mandate with a lot of wrist slapping. It could just be getting them at that early moment, and that's kind of almost like to Buddha's point about advocacy. There are human elements that have to go into the thinking about how to make that a nice glide path to production. But I do think beyond the advocacy, leaning too hard on advocacy means that you're in conversations all the time, which is great with kin, right? Because conversations matter. But if you don't materialize the learnings and the enduring value of those conversations into exercisable, templatable, documented, paved paths, and the documentation should not be exhaustive. It should be from a perspective of how, if I was the dev using this, how quickly could I get up and running with
Yeah.
the safety guardrails in place?
Yeah. Agreed. Um, we're at time. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Any last comments or things you guys would like to see in future ones? People here, topics, concepts?
Well, I think, and just to reinforce Paul's point, APIs don't live by themselves. So a big point of creating guardrails, which are enforced down the line, is betting on API blueprints, and that really shines from having a federated API governance. You talk with people in the right time, and you pre-package architecture decisions, not only ADRs, but blueprints of APIs, complete with sample architectures that teams can now iterate on and apply in a more massive scale and be freed of taking or considering decisions over and over again. So a big point of API governance, for me at least, is synthesizing these blueprints in order to free teams to do their work with the greatest quality possible.
I think exploring possible blueprints is another future topic that I want to go into. Any other thoughts, Dave, Buddha, Paul?
For me, what are the elements of a governance program? I think if you were to start today or looking to mature your governance practices, what would those key elements look like? And again, I'm not talking specifically about technology. We should include that. But outside of technology as well, the people process element of it, what would a mature API governance strategy look like at an enterprise level? I think it'll be good to dive into something like that.
Like that maturity. Agreed.
Would it be all right, real quick? I know this is recorded. I don't know or care what you do with it, but I've got notes, my own notes, right, on Post-its, and I could take a picture. I've mostly blotted out, any kind of names for anything, but captured some of the bullet points. Would it be okay if I take a picture of this conversation
I'm fine with it.
and put it in the comments of Ken's follow-up?
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's fine with me.
We share with the group. I'll be posting this video in the transcript, and then I'm going to be kind of mining it for topics and things that we can continue next time, as well as that I want to reach out to folks and get people coming that I know have opinions or are experts on those topics. So please share any notes, share any thoughts afterwards. And then Buddha, I really want to try to figure out the cross-pollination between a centralized and federated approach to these governance talks, and figure out how to get people over to Tyke's conversations and continue these in a kind of ongoing way. I don't think this should be the only place where we do this. And then figure out how to get the rest of the vendors involved and other people involved as well. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll reach out to you on that. I've got some thoughts now, finally. So I'll reach out to you. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you, everyone. Same time next week. We're gonna just keep building momentum here. So when you got time, I appreciate your expertise and your questions and thoughts. Thanks for coming by.
Thank you very much.
Cheers, folks.
Bye-bye.
Been a pleasure. Bye-bye.
Thanks.